She stood in the middle of a snow-covered plain, watching as 3 impregnable military fortresses vanished in a massive pillar of flame overnight. The pride of the American army and hundreds of armed soldiers simply dissolved into the icy fog, leaving absolutely no trace behind. The United States government had spent millions of dollars and years of hard labor building these massive fortifications along the dangerous Bozeman Trail. But the fearsome Cheyenne warriors had, in some unimaginable way, wiped them off the face of the earth in the midst of the harshest winter. But what really happened to Colonel Henry Carrington when he tried to hold this cursed, frozen land? Today's story comes to us from a viewer named David from Bozeman, Montana. He writes, "Dear author, my great-grandfather was a military scout in Wyoming and always said that the Indians possessed some ancient magic that allowed them to burn the forts to the ground." Well, David, thank you so much for this amazing tip for our new historical investigation. I can confidently say that the truth about these winter events is far more terrifying than any old mystical legend. So buckle up, folks. We're heading out on a very cold and dangerous journey through the Wild West. Our story takes place during the harsh winter of 1868 in Wyoming, right at the foot of the snow-capped Bighorn Mountains. In those days, this land remained a completely wild and unpredictable frontier, where the law was dictated solely by the weight of a lead bullet. By all accounts, survival here required incredible courage, bordering on outright madness and utter recklessness. Winters brought with them a biting wind that could easily freeze an unwary traveler right in the saddle of his horse. It was here that Colonel Henry Carrington, an experienced military engineer and commander of Fort Phil Kearny, carried out his difficult service. Henry was a man of strict military discipline, with a neat beard and eyes, accustomed to constantly reading complex construction blueprints. The people in the wooden garrison respected him for his fairness, though many young lieutenants considered him too cautious a commander. His wife, Margaret Carrington, was the true heart and soul of this harsh settlement on the very edge of the boundless, dangerous prairie. She kept detailed diaries describing every day of their hard life and tried to keep up the morale of the exhausted soldiers. It seems to me that without her warm support, half the garrison would have long since gone mad from despair and constant fear. The people had little time for long reflections, for firewood, for the voracious stoves had to be gathered every single day. Lumberjacks set out for the pine forest a few miles from the fort, under heavy guard by mounted soldiers. The risk of being shot from the bushes was so great that the men literally slept with their loaded rifles in their arms. During that tense period, the US Army built 3 large forts: Reno, Phil Kearny, and C.F. Smith. They were tasked with guarding the Bozeman Trail around the clock, along which heavy wagons carrying settlers made their way to the gold fields of Montana. The Cheyenne and their loyal Lakota allies rightly considered these vast lands their best hunting grounds. They had no intention of surrendering their sacred valleys to the newcomers who were mercilessly exterminating the bison and cutting down the ancient forests. The air above the plains was constantly thick with the smell of smoke from burning wagons, signaling the start of Chief Red Cloud's merciless war. The military's chief scout and guide was the famous mountain man and trapper named Jim Bridger. This experienced fellow knew every hidden trail in the Rocky Mountains and could read tracks on the ground better than any bloodhound. Jim wore a worn deerskin jacket, richly decorated with beads, and constantly chewed strong leaf tobacco. He often warned the officers that the Indians were just waiting for the right moment to strike a decisive, crushing blow. Unfortunately, the young military academy graduates rarely heeded the old man's advice, considering themselves invincible heroes. In the fall of 1868, the government in distant Washington suddenly decided to radically change its policy on the country's western borders. Politicians signed a peace treaty at Fort Laramie, solemnly promising the Indians to withdraw all troops from this disputed territory. With the onset of the first heavy frosts, the atmosphere around the bastions became simply unbearably heavy and tense. Hundreds of Indian campfires lit up the surrounding hills at night, flickering in the darkness like the eyes of hungry predators. The Cheyenne warriors did not launch an attack. They simply waited in silence for the pale faces to keep their official word and leave. Margaret Carrington wrote in her diary that this deathly silence frightened her more than the loudest war cries. Soon, the entire garrison would have to set out on a long and deadly journey through a brewing snowstorm.
Godspeed, boys.
Thank you, ma'am.
Be safe.
Evacuating a military settlement of this scale was an incredibly complex, lengthy, and extremely exhausting undertaking for everyone involved. The soldiers had to load heavy cast iron stoves, barrels of salted meat, and crates of valuable ammunition onto unwieldy carts. Word of the army's imminent retreat spread through all the surrounding isolated settlements and prospectors' camps. Many civilians decided to join the military convoy, rightly fearing to remain in the wilds without the soldiers' protection. A strange mixture of relief at the imminent return home and bitter disappointment at the forced defeat hung in the icy air. Jim Bridger watched these hasty preparations gloomily, sitting pensively on a wooden barrel by the main gate. He understood perfectly well that the long, unwieldy column of wagons on the snow-covered road would be an ideal target for an ambush. The old trapper advised Henry Carrington to post reinforced double guards on the flanks and under no circumstances to stretch the formation. The colonel, having learned from the bitter experience of past losses on that cursed road, fully agreed with the arguments of his experienced guide. The children playing nearby in the snow shouted joyfully, looking forward to the great journey, completely unaware of the threat hanging over them. On August 20th, the garrison of the most remote Fort C.F. Smith was the first to leave its well-established, well-fortified positions. As soon as the last creaking wagon crossed the gate, hundreds of painted horsemen instantly appeared on the snow-covered hills. And while Henry Carrington watched this through his brass spyglass, the Cheyenne began to act with astonishing speed. They did not aggressively pursue the column of retreating white men, which greatly surprised all military analysts of the time. Their sole target was the wooden fortifications themselves, which they had hated with all their hearts for many years. Within a few short hours, a thick, impenetrable column of acrid black smoke rose above the abandoned fort. The enraged Indians set every outbuilding, every supply barn, and every tall observation tower ablaze to the very ground. The flames roared with such terrifying force that their ominous red glows were clearly visible for miles across the night sky. By all accounts, it was a spectacle of terrifying, primal power, erasing the traces of Western civilization from the face of the untouched land. The wilderness and its true, rightful masters were forcibly reclaiming what belonged to them by birthright. A week later, it was Fort Reno's fateful turn. Its garrison also set out on a march toward the safety of the East. The situation repeated itself with terrifying and inevitable precision, as if following some sinister, pre-rehearsed script from a theatrical play. No sooner had the thick dust from the army wagons settled than the massive wooden walls instantly burst into bright, devouring flames. The Cheyennes acted in unison and methodically, hurling flaming torches onto the dry roofs of the wooden barracks and spacious officers' quarters. The U.S. Army was irrevocably losing its main strongholds in the harsh north without firing a single defensive shot. In the end, the turn came for the most impregnable and largest bastion, the great Fort Phil Kearny. Carrington's exhausted garrison was forced to march out at the onset of deep winter, when the narrow roads were already covered with a thick layer of ice. The soldiers wrapped themselves in heavy blue overcoats and bearskins, desperately trying to warm their hands, which had gone numb in the biting wind. The supply train stretched for several long miles, its wooden wheels creaking slowly over the frozen ground, hard as granite. Every armed man in the column kept glancing back, tensely awaiting a sudden attack from the snowy vale. When the massive gates of Phil Kearny slammed shut behind the last soldiers, the Indians immediately emerged silently from the dense forest. Their proud chief, Little Wolf, sat motionless on his warhorse, watching the retreating enemy troops intently. Fierce fire voraciously devoured the massive pine logs, melted the thick cast iron grates, and destroyed the remnants of the army's grandeur. The acrid smoke was so thick and black that it covered the entire sky above the plain. turning a clear, frosty day into dark twilight. The exhausted soldiers in the retreating column could clearly see this smoke and silently cross themselves, sincerely thanking God for their miraculous salvation. The great wooden empire, built here with such immense toil and blood, collapsed in just a few short winter days. It was an incredible, truly unprecedented event in the long and bloody history of the conquest of the American continent. To many at the time, it seemed that this was where the story should logically end. The army had left for good, and the Indians had burned the empty houses. But this is precisely where the strangest, most inexplicable, and most frightening part of this entire winter military saga on the Bozeman Trail begins. A few months after the fires, the government secretly sent a small mounted reconnaissance unit there to assess the damage. They were to carefully sketch the charred ruins and check whether anything of value remained among the blackened remains of the forts. What they discovered with horror upon arriving at their destination robbed them of normal, peaceful sleep forever. A small reconnaissance party under the command of young Lieutenant Thomas Harper arrived in the valley in the early rainy spring. Sitting in the saddle of his large black horse, Thomas was dressed in warm cavalry cloth and a fluffy fur hat. The second man on this tense patrol was the experienced tracker Samuel Clark, a stern, taciturn man with a long scar on his cheek. They had expected to find nothing but piles of charred logs and huge mounds of grey ash where the fortifications had once stood. However, the actual scene that unfolded before their eyes caused their war horses to recoil in fear and alarm. On April 23rd, Thomas and Samuel finally reached the very spot where Fort Phil Kearny had once loomed menacingly. And as Thomas Harper watched this scene through his binoculars with disbelief, his frozen hands began to tremble treacherously at the sight. In place of the massive military fortress, there was not a single charred log, not a single rusty bent nail or shard of glass. The vast area, spanning several dozen acres, was absolutely clean, as if it had been swept by a giant invisible broom. The ground was perfectly level, and the first fresh green grass was already sprouting where the deep foundations had once been. The baffled scouts immediately headed for the ruins of Fort Reno, desperately hoping to find the explanation for this impossible phenomenon there, at least. The men had little time for silly superstitions, but even the most battle-hardened soldiers began whispering fearfully about black magic. Samuel Clark timidly suggested that the Indians might have hauled away the remains of the charred wood for their own needs immediately after the Great Fire. But this did not in the least explain the mysterious disappearance of the heavy stone foundations and the enormous, immovable cast iron furnaces. Just to clear away such a colossal amount of debris, the Indians would have needed hundreds of wagons and many months of continuous, back-breaking labor. The Cheyenne, however, were free nomads for whom such grandiose and pointless construction work was absolutely unnecessary. Hurrying back to the nearest settlement, the pale Lieutenant Harper immediately sent an urgent government telegram to his superiors in the east. The text of his official dispatch sounded like the ravings of a madman to the officials in Washington. The forts have vanished without a trace. No signs of fire or debris have been found. The grey-haired generals in Washington initially decided that the inexperienced scouts had simply gotten lost on the prairie and mixed up their coordinates. Word spread like wildfire about this incredible and terrifying discovery across all the major newspapers on America's East Coast. Journalists scrambled to write sensational headlines claiming that the wild Cheyenne Indians had made a direct pact with the devil himself. Excited people discussed this mysterious enigma in noisy pubs, smoky saloons, and at elegant social gatherings in New York and Boston. How on earth could three massive wooden cities, painstakingly built by the US Army, simply vanish without a trace? Tension in society was rapidly mounting, turning a humiliating military defeat into a grand, nationwide mystery thriller. The authorities' official and terse response was entirely predictable. They simply classified all the results of Professor Edward Hayes's excavations. The War Department categorically refused to publicly admit that they could not explain the mysterious disappearance of their own fortresses. Strange and frightening additional events began to occur in that deserted valley with enviable and terrifying regularity. Local hunters recounted with trembling voices that at night, on the empty plains, they could clearly hear the sound of an army bugle. Some farmers swore on the Bible that they had seen the ghostly outlines of high walls, eerily emerging through the thick morning fog. These tales compelled impressionable settlers to take a huge detour with their wagons, just to avoid passing by the cursed places. The story of the bastions wiped from the face of the earth was rapidly becoming overgrown with new and incredible mystical layers.
Quiet. It's too dark.
The growing panic among Wyoming's ordinary settlers reached such a high level that many began hastily selling their farms. No one felt safe anymore, knowing that entire massive military bases could vanish as if by magic. Local, exhausted sheriffs received hundreds of angry letters from citizens urgently demanding that the army be brought back immediately for protection. But the government flatly refused to violate the recent peace treaty with the Native Americans for the sake of the peace of mind of a handful of farmers on the edge of the country. People were left completely alone with the harsh, wild wilderness and their own deep, primal fears. Former Army guide Jim Bridger, who was peacefully living out his final days on a small farm, could only laugh bitterly at these rumors. The wise old trapper always told the young that every cunning Native American trick had a perfectly simple, down-to-earth explanation. Meanwhile, the greedy newspapers published more and more detailed interviews with the surviving soldiers from the Carrington garrison. The shrewd journalists pried the tiniest details out of them about the evacuation and the final tense moments before the fortress was set ablaze. Lieutenant Harper, the first to discover the empty, cursed land, became a true local celebrity and a frequent guest of New York reporters. His public accounts grew increasingly emotional, and the sentences in his interviews became shorter and more abrupt. He often repeated to reporters with a tremor in his voice, "We clearly saw a huge flame, but when we returned, there wasn't even a handful of black ash left." His widow, Margaret Carrington, upon hearing the strange and frightening news from Wyoming, was utterly shaken to the core. In her famous memoirs, she described every structure of the fort in incredible detail, proving that these were not flimsy temporary shacks. To build Phil Kearney, more than 4,000 massive pine logs were hand-hewn from the nearby wilderness. The complete disappearance of such a colossal mass of timber defied all known laws of physics or common sense. She began actively corresponding with officers herself, trying to piece together all the scattered fragments of this strange puzzle. In 1870, a group of independent private investigators from Chicago arrived in this mysterious region, secretly hired by wealthy local farmers. They brought with them the latest European equipment for complex topographic surveying and in-depth chemical analysis of the soil. This sensational discovery sent shockwaves through the scientific community and gave rise to even more absurd and fantastical speculations. Some hotheads began to assert with certainty that the army had never in its life built these massive defensive forts. They boldly claimed that all the construction documents and reports were simply a massive financial scam orchestrated by greedy generals in the capital. But this theory was easily shattered by thousands of testimonies from actual settlers who had personally traded within those high walls for a long time. The forts definitely existed, and this was an indisputable historical fact, firmly confirmed by reliable documentary sources and letters. And so, heated debates about this paradox continued for several decades, never subsiding for a single moment in academic circles. Brilliant historians wrote thick monographs, desperately trying to logically explain this phenomenon through rare natural disasters. With each passing year, the hope of ever learning the true fate of the forts melted away, like dirty spring snow under the hot sun. The older generation of eyewitnesses to those events was gradually passing away, taking their precious memories to the grave forever. The proud Cheyenne Indians maintained their stony silence, flatly refusing to discuss their long-ago great victories with white historians and journalists. It seemed to everyone that this vivid chapter in the history of the American West would forever remain shrouded in a thick, impenetrable mystical fog. But the long-awaited answer suddenly came from a place where no one had expected to find it all these long years. Let's take a closer look at all those popular theories that people actively put forward during those difficult and turbulent times. The first version was that the Cheyenne secretly forced thousands of captive white settlers to do hard labor. Supporters of this wild idea believed that the Native Americans forced their slaves to dismantle the forts log by log and carry all the building materials away. These logs were then allegedly dumped en masse into deep canyons so that the army could not use them again for construction. But no one ever found any convincing evidence of a mass movement of people carrying heavy loads over vast distances. A second, rather exotic theory boldly blamed it all on giant underground worms or unknown prehistoric monsters. By the late 19th century, paleontologists had just begun actively excavating giant dinosaur bones in the Wild West. Uneducated, simple settlers readily believed that ancient monsters could suddenly awaken and swallow entire wooden buildings. The third theory sounded much more plausible than the others and was directly linked to mass hallucinations caused by poisoned water. Some respected doctors speculated that the thick smoke from Native American campfires contained specific and very potent psychotropic plants. People had little time to thoroughly investigate every wild hypothesis. But the conversations never stopped for a single day. People gathered on the wooden porches of their homes, heatedly discussing newspaper clippings and fresh letters from relatives in the East. Every farmer fancied himself a great detective, capable of easily untangling this complex web of contradictory facts and absurd rumors. Even noisy crowds of tourists began flocking to wild Wyoming, eager to see the mysterious, completely empty clearings with their own eyes. Enterprising locals began brazenly selling them fake army buttons, supposedly miraculously found at the sites where the forts had vanished. But this did not happen because ordinary people were frankly stupid or overly naive in their categorical judgments. It was because the human mind desperately needs a logical conclusion to any frightening and completely incomprehensible story. The unknown always frightens us far more and more intensely than even the most brutal, yet fully understandable and tangible Native American enemy. By all accounts, the harsh life on the frontier was already full of mortal dangers and daily, exhausting anxieties. Adding mystical, supernatural disappearances to this long list was simply unbearable for the fragile psyches of ordinary laborers. By the early 20th century, this sensational story had gradually turned into a harmless local folktale for young children. The kids would scare each other before bedtime with stories about an invisible fort that appears ghost-like only on clear nights with a full moon. Science fiction writers began actively using this gripping plot in their adventure novels about evil Native American sorcerers and dark magic. Real historical facts became heavily overlaid with layers of fiction, ultimately turning into an inextricable tangle of fabrications and old contradictions. It suddenly turned out that the winter of 1868 was one of the most incredibly harsh in the entire history of weather observations in this region. The temperature of the frosty air plummeted to record lows, and powerful snowstorms raged for weeks on end. But the most interesting and important fact turned out to be the records of the strongest hurricane-force icy winds that constantly blew from the mountains. The speed of these dense streams of cold air reached such immense levels that they could easily knock a strong adult horse off its feet. This climatic fact, seemingly insignificant at first glance, became the very first key to understanding the historical catastrophe that had occurred. The graduate student also stumbled upon the rare diaries of one of the Lakota chiefs, which had been transcribed by a white anthropologist many years later. These old, worn notebooks contained an incredibly detailed description of the tactics the Native Americans successfully employed in destroying white settlements. It turned out that the Cheyenne did not simply throw torches haphazardly at random buildings, as the frightened soldiers had vividly described. They masterfully employed a complex system of controlled arson, knowing exactly how fire spreads in strong, hurricane-force winds. These invaluable documents shed a completely new, dazzling light on the underappreciated military genius of the indigenous peoples of America. A complex historical puzzle began to slowly come together, harmoniously combining scientific weather data with the ancient knowledge of the Great Plains Native American tribes. It became absolutely clear that mysticism and magic had nothing to do with it, and that the truth lay in the strict laws of physics. The researchers finally realized that for decades they had been looking for the wrong clues in the wrong place. They were diligently preparing to make a sensational official announcement that would forever change the perception of those long-ago winter events. And this sensational announcement was supposed to shatter all the absurd myths that had accumulated in American society for over half a century. But if you really want to know the truth, then get ready to hear a completely incredible and astonishing scientific explanation. It turned out that the forts really were burnt to the ground. The retreating army wasn't lying at all, and the huge column of smoke was absolutely real. However, the cunning Cheyenne set all the buildings ablaze at the very moment when a fierce mountain gale began. This raging wind instantly turned an ordinary fire into a giant wind tunnel, heating the raging flames to unimaginable temperatures. The fire was so monstrously intense that it didn't just char the dry wood, it literally vaporized it without a trace. That is precisely why there were no large charred logs or the familiar grey piles of ash left on the frozen ground. The incredible, infernal heat turned the entire massive tree into the finest dust, which the hurricane immediately scattered for dozens of miles around. The heavy stone foundations cracked loudly from the sudden temperature change, and the strong wind swept the small stone fragments far out into the prairie. What remained of the heavy, molten cast-iron furnaces was securely buried under a thick layer of fresh snow. The Indians brilliantly harnessed the crushing power of nature to do all the dirty cleanup work for them, free of charge. The scientists, who had finally published this sensational report, expected a veritable storm of outrage from conservative white society. But instead, their sensational discovery was met with immense relief and genuine, sincere historical interest. People finally, once and for all, rid themselves of their long-standing, irrational fears of the unknown, mystical evil of the prairies. They were able to fully appreciate the wisdom and incredible resourcefulness of the Native Americans who desperately defended their ancestral lands. The story of the vanished forts quickly ceased to be a scary tale and became a subject of deep historical respect for the Native Americans. Margaret Carrington, unfortunately, did not live to see the revelation of this amazing and once frightening mystery of the Bozeman Trail. But her detailed and honest diaries have become a truly invaluable source for modern historians deeply studying that brutal conflict. She carefully preserved for us the atmosphere of that harsh time, describing the difficult lives and fears of ordinary people on the wild frontier. Her sincere words constantly remind us of the incredibly high price paid for the settlement of these wild and beautiful lands. And as we read her writings with interest, the bright memory of those brave people continues to live on in our hearts. Jim Bridger turned out to be absolutely right in his very earliest, purely pragmatic and down-to-earth assessments of this event. There really was a perfectly simple, yet no less ingenious, earthly explanation for the Indians' terrifying tricks. The old, experienced trapper always knew for certain that the wild nature of the frontier is the most formidable and unpredictable ally. It is a pity that the arrogant military generals did not heed his wise counsel and greatly underestimated the intelligence of their desperate enemies. This foolish mistake cost young America millions of dollars and subjected it to many long years of humiliating and clinging fear.